Life has a way of testing us in the quietest, most unexpected moments. We spend so much time worrying about betrayal, about broken trust in love and family, that sometimes we forget the simplest vows we owe one another as human beings: respect, compassion, dignity. Too often, cruelty feels easier than kindness. A careless word, a mocking glance, a cruel laugh, it can scar deeper than any wound from war. But every so often, one act of decency, one choice to stand up in the face of ridicule, can change not just a day, but an entire community. What you're about to hear is not just a story of scars or of a man with a past written in blood and sacrifice. It is the story of a diner, a group of teenagers, and a father who refused to let cruelty pass unchecked. It is the story of how whispers became waves and how a forgotten hero, mocked for the face he could not change, was revealed for the courage he never stopped carrying. Stay with me, because this tale will stir you, challenge you, and remind you what true loyalty looks like. And if it moves you, I invite you to follow along, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. You'll want to see how it ends. The Riverside Diner was the kind of place people passed by 100 times without noticing. Its neon sign flickered, buzzing faintly against the night sky, and the smell of frying bacon and coffee hung in the air like a permanent perfume. Inside, regulars claimed their usual booths, the staff moved with practiced rhythm, and the world outside seemed far away. But for Daniel Morgan, this was not a refuge. It was a battlefield of a different kind. Daniel worked quietly, sleeves rolled down as much as the uniform allowed, head bent, eyes averted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who once had commanded attention. Now people noticed him for different reasons. The scars were carved across his face and neck, drew stares he pretended not to see. Children sometimes gasped. Adults looked away too quickly, and laughter, quiet, sharp, mocking, followed him more often than he admitted. On that particular evening, Daniel had just cleared a table near the window when he felt it. The prickle of eyes on his back, the hiss of laughter muffled, but pointed. A group of teenagers sat in the corner booth, phones glowing in their hands. They weren't subtle. One leaned toward another, snapping a photo while whispering, "He looks straight out of a horror movie." Another snickered, their laughter rising like static. Daniel kept moving, his face expressionless, his hands steady as he wiped the table. He had learned long ago that reacting only fed them. But deep inside, a small weight pressed heavier against his chest. Across the diner, Carl Wilson sat with his teenage son Alex, enjoying what was supposed to be an ordinary dinner. Carl was a man weathered by years, broad-shouldered himself, though softened by time and office work. He had seen enough of the world to know cruelty when it appeared. At first, he thought little of the group of teens until he caught sight of his own son joining in. Laughing, smirking, glancing at his phone. Carl's gaze sharpened. His eyes drifted from Alex to the man those kids were mocking. Daniel's sleeve had slid up slightly as he reached for a pitcher of water, and there, etched in ink across his forearm, was a tattoo Carl hadn't seen in years. The symbol of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. His breath caught. He froze. That mark belonged to a brotherhood Carl knew through stories, through his eldest son James, who had served. For a moment, Carl saw not the diner, not the teenagers, not even his son beside him. He saw desert sand, the flicker of explosions, the names whispered over folded flags. He saw faces he would never meet, men who had been saved and men who had not. His throat tightened as he realized what stood before him. A man those kids mocked as a monster was in truth something far rarer. A medic who had carried others through hell. His chair scraped sharply against the floor as he stood. The sound cut through the laughter at the booth. Alex looked up, startled, as Carl reached across the table, snatching the phone from his son's hand with a grip firm enough to sting. The screen lit with the cruel photo. Daniel's scarred profile caught mid-turn, frozen forever in ridicule. Carl's jaw clenched. "This," Carl said, holding the phone high enough for the booth to see, "is the worst thing I have ever seen you do." His voice was low, but it carried. The teens shrank back. Even Daniel paused mid-step, pitcher in hand, eyes flicking toward the scene. Carl's thumb pressed firmly, deleting the photo, erasing the ugliness as best he could. though he knew the damage already stretched further. He turned, catching the eye of the diner's manager at the counter. "Give that man my name and number," Carl said. His voice wavered with something between anger and grief. "Tell him it's from Lieutenant Wilson's father. He'll understand." The diner seemed to hold its breath. The teens stared at their plates, their earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of Carl's fury. Alex flushed red, shame burning across his face, but the lesson had been planted deeper than embarrassment. Daniel, still by the counter, set the pitcher down with deliberate care. His scarred face betrayed no emotion, but his eyes lingered on Carl a second longer than before. Carl sat again, heavy with the moment. His son avoided his gaze, shoulders hunched, while the laughter that had filled the booth died into silence. Around them, other diners pretended not to stare, yet the air was different now, charged, solemn, aware. For the first time that night, Daniel was no longer invisible, nor was he simply a man to mock. He was something else entirely, though the full truth had yet to ripple outward. Daniel turned back to his work, but his steps were slower, his mind caught on the words he had overheard. Lieutenant Wilson's father. He hadn't heard that name in years. Memories stirred, unbidden, shouts, blood, the desert night. He pressed them down, returning to the rhythm of dishes and tables. But the past had already been called back into the present, and outside that small diner, beyond neon lights and greasy windows, the story was about to grow wings. What began as a cruel laugh and a stolen photo would soon become something far larger. An echo that reached far beyond that corner booth, carried by voices Daniel never expected to hear again. Night fell heavy over the small town, and the Riverside Diner dimmed its lights, neon buzzing faintly against the darkness. Inside, Daniel Morgan lingered after closing, wiping down tables with a quiet efficiency that belied the storm inside his chest. He had heard Carl Wilson's words. He had heard the name. Lieutenant Wilson's father. Memories pressed in like shadows. Desert heat, fractured screams, the metallic tang of blood on sand. He forced them back. He had built a life of silence here. A life where no one asked and he did not tell. But silence had a way of breaking when least expected. Carl Wilson sat in his home that night with his laptop open, his hands heavy on the keyboard. His wife had long gone to bed, and the house was hushed, save for the quiet ticking of the old clock in the hallway. But Carl could not sleep. He could still see Daniel's face, the scars etched deep, the way those teenagers laughed as though mocking a man were sport. He could not stand it. He began typing, his words raw, unpolished, but fueled by something unshakable. He opened a private group, one that only veterans and their families knew. It was where men and women who had carried rifles, or those who had waited at home for letters, found each other across miles and years. The group wasn't large by internet standards, but it was fierce, tight, and loyal. Carl poured the story out. "Tonight in my hometown diner, a group of kids mocked a man. They took pictures, they laughed. What they didn't know is that he's one of yours. A corpsman, Doc Morgan. He's the reason my son is alive. And now he works unnoticed, ridiculed for scars that should be honored. We can't let him believe he's forgotten." He hit post, his hand trembling slightly as the words disappeared into the blue glow of the screen. For a moment he wondered if anyone would see. But within minutes, comments began to appear, names he didn't know, words that burned with recognition. "Doc Morgan? He carried me out in Fallujah. He saved my squad leader. We thought he was gone, but Doc wouldn't quit. I remember that night, sandstorm, ambush. If it wasn't for him, my brother wouldn't have come home." The names spread like wildfire. Screenshots of Carl's post were shared to other groups, other pages, whispered from one veteran to another, carried like a flag through digital trenches. By dawn, thousands had seen it. By noon, tens of thousands. The story spread not with empty hashtags, but with testimony. Men and women who owed their lives, or the lives of someone they loved, to a medic who now washed dishes in a diner. At the same time, something darker moved alongside it. The photos those teens had taken, the cruel snapshots of Daniel's face, had leaked beyond their phones. By morning, the images floated across social media platforms, where strangers who didn't know his story left laughing comments, comparing him to monsters, villains, things less than human. For a brief moment, cruelty had the louder voice. But then the tide turned. Veterans descended on those posts like a storm. They didn't curse or threaten. They didn't match cruelty with cruelty. They simply told the truth. "That's Doc. He dragged me out with a shattered femur." "You call him a monster? He carried kids bleeding in the street, gave them a chance to live. Delete this, show some respect." And people listened. The laughter quieted. The photos began disappearing, taken down by embarrassed teenagers who hadn't expected to provoke an army of grateful men and women. Where there had been mockery, now there was silence. And beneath the silence, something new began to rise. By the second day, local residents who had seen Daniel behind the counter started looking at him differently. Where once they had stared too long, now they looked quickly, then looked again. Not with disgust, but with recognition. A man whispered to his wife, "That's him. He was in Fallujah." A young mother nudged her child, saying softly, "Tell him thank you." Daniel noticed. He always noticed. His eyes tracked the shifts in people's stares, the murmurs that followed him. He didn't understand it yet, not fully, but he felt the weight of something gathering, pressing in from the edges of his quiet life. He worked his shift as always, silent, deliberate, focused, but the air around him was different, charged in ways that made his chest tighten. The manager, Mike, found himself staring too. He had always kept Daniel out of the front whenever possible, telling himself it was for business, that customers didn't want to see someone who looked like Daniel. But now, as he saw people lean in, whispering Daniel's name with reverence, he wondered if he had been wrong. Deep down, guilt prickled at him, sharp and unrelenting. The shift ended, and Daniel walked home along the quiet streets, his boots scuffing against cracked pavement. He did not own a television, did not bother with social media. He had no idea that his name was surging across screens, carried by voices he hadn't heard in over a decade. He had no idea that while he folded into the silence of his small apartment, the world outside had begun to remember him. At the Wilson household, Alex sat in his room, phone buzzing with messages. His friends were panicked. The photo they had taken had drawn fire from people they didn't know, people with badges, medals, scars of their own. They were deleting posts, apologizing, trying to erase their cruelty before it swallowed them. Alex stared at the screen, feeling the weight of shame he had never known before. His father's words replayed in his mind, "The worst thing I have ever seen you do." And now the world seemed to agree. Meanwhile, Carl watched the story spread and felt both relief and sorrow. Relief that Daniel was being recognized, sorrow that it had taken cruelty to bring it about. He thought of his eldest son, James, of the nights when James spoke of the men who patched bodies with bare hands, who dragged them through gunfire. James had once said, "Without the docs, we'd have come home in boxes." And now Carl realized the man at the diner was one of those docs. He had been serving the town quietly, unseen, until cruelty forced the world to see him. The name Doc Morgan began to echo in places Daniel could not hear, across states, through bases, within families who whispered it over dinner tables. Soldiers who had been pulled from the edge of death wrote his name with trembling gratitude. Wives who had received husbands back alive because of his hands wept as they typed their thanks. Children who had never met him posted, "My dad said Doc Morgan is the reason I was born." It was no longer just a diner story. It was becoming something else. A movement, a reckoning, a reminder that scars are not shameful but sacred. By the third day, strangers began showing up at the Riverside Diner, not for the pancakes or the burgers, but to catch a glimpse of him. They didn't ask for autographs or photos. They only wanted to sit near him, to nod, to leave extra tips with notes that said things like, "Thank you for carrying us." Daniel, baffled, pocketed the notes without a word, unsure what to make of them. But the storm was only beginning. Letters were on their way. Uniforms were being pressed. Plans were being made. The diner that once smelled only of grease and coffee was about to become something else entirely. A sanctuary, a stage, a place where silence would break wide open. And Daniel, who had worked so hard to remain invisible, was about to learn that no matter how far he ran from the battlefield, the men he saved would always find him. The diner opened to another morning, the hiss of the griddle and the aroma of coffee masking the tension that seemed to live in the walls now. Customers came and went, as they always had, but something about the way they looked at Daniel was different. Their eyes lingered longer, softer, more curious than cruel. Still, Daniel kept his head low, apron tied, sleeves rolled, moving from table to table with the same steady rhythm he had kept since the day he started. It was just after the breakfast rush when the first letter came. The manager, Mike, found it tucked under the glass sugar dispenser at a corner booth. The envelope was plain, the handwriting shaky but deliberate. To Doc Morgan. Mike frowned at the words. He knew Daniel as Daniel, not Doc. But curiosity pricked him, and instead of tossing it aside, he slid it into his pocket until he could decide what to do. Later in the break room, with the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, Mike opened it. The letter was written on lined notebook paper, the ink smudged in places, but the words were steady enough. You don't know me, but I know you. Fallujah, 2004. You carried me almost 2 kilometers with a hole in my leg and bullets everywhere. You didn't stop, even when we told you to leave me. Because of you, I'm here today. If you're washing dishes, I'll mop floors. If you're serving food, I'll bust tables. Whatever it takes, you won't be doing it alone. Corporal Andrew Fletcher, USMC. Mike sat back, the words heavy in his hands. He had worked with Daniel for months, always keeping him in the back when he could, telling himself it was for the comfort of the customers. He had seen the stares, heard the whispers, and instead of fighting them, he had quietly contributed to Daniel's invisibility. Now, reading the letter, guilt crawled up his throat. Another envelope arrived the next day. Then another. Some were slid across counters by strangers who never gave names. Others came in the mail, addressed simply to Doc Morgan, Riverside Diner. One note read, "You patched me up with nothing but a shirt and your bare hands. My wife says I wouldn't have lived another hour, thank you." Another said, "My brother didn't make it, but he told me before he went that you were the reason he had a chance to say goodbye." Each message was a wound and a balm. Mike collected them in a small box he kept beneath the register, his hands shaking every time he added a new one. He didn't know when or how to give them to Daniel. A part of him feared what might happen if Daniel saw them. If the quiet man with scars and silence was forced to relive the past he had worked so hard to bury. But another part of him, the part that had begun to feel like a coward, knew Daniel deserved to hear every word. Customers began leaving more than just letters. A receipt slipped across the counter one afternoon had a note scrawled on the back. "You saved me in Ramadi. I couldn't forget your face, even if I tried." Another came with a $50 tip and the words, "From a Navy brother, you saved one of ours." Mike read each one, his chest tightening, his shame deepening. He started watching Daniel differently. Where once he had seen an employee who made people uncomfortable, now he saw a man who had walked through fire for others and come out carrying scars no one could measure. Daniel never spoke of it, never hinted at the weight he carried. He scrubbed plates, filled coffee, and swept floors with the same discipline he must have once used to tie tourniquets and stitch wounds under fire. It was on the third evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the diner floor, that Mike finally broke. He carried the small box of letters into the break room, where Daniel sat alone, eating a sandwich in silence. Mike set the box down on the table with a soft thud. "These came for you," Mike said, his voice rougher than usual. Daniel looked up, startled. His eyes flicked from Mike's face to the box, suspicion narrowing them. "What is it?" "Read them." Daniel hesitated, his hand hovering over the lid as though it might burn him. Finally, with a breath, he opened it. The letters lay stacked inside, some neat, some crumpled, all filled with words he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He pulled one free and unfolded it, then another, and another. The silence in the room deepened as he read. His jaw clenched, his hands trembling despite the years of training that once kept them steady under fire. Memories crashed in with every line, the smell of burning sand, the sound of men crying out, the weight of bodies across his shoulders. He had spent years trying to bury it all, to build a life where no one saw him as a symbol of war. Now those years of silence were unraveling with each page. Mike shifted uncomfortably, watching a man he had never truly known begin to break in front of him. I should have treated you better," Mike admitted. "I kept you in the back because I thought it was easier, for the customers, for business. But it wasn't right. Reading those letters, You're not someone to hide. You're someone people need to see." Daniel didn't respond at first. He simply folded the letters back into the box and closed the lid, his breath heavy, his face unreadable. Finally, he said quietly, "They're mistaken. I didn't save anyone. I just tried not to lose them all." But the words rang hollow even to himself. The next day, the diner felt different again. Customers spoke Daniel's name softly, some slipping him notes or shaking his hand with quiet gratitude. A woman with gray hair pressed his hand and whispered, "My son came home because of you." Daniel tried to pull away, but her grip was firm, her eyes wet with tears. He said nothing, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely unseen. By evening, the whispers had grown louder. Nods of respect replaced glances of pity. Thank yous replaced hurried looks away. The town was shifting, though Daniel resisted believing it. Change, in his experience, never lasted. But something in the way people said "Doc" instead of "Sir" or "Hey" made him pause. The quiet life he had fought to protect was unraveling. But in its place, something else was forming. Something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he wanted. The man who had chosen invisibility was being pulled into the light, and the world seemed determined not to let him slip back into the shadows. Outside, the streets darkened, but inside the diner, a storm of gratitude was gathering. Letters, receipts, handshakes. They were just the beginning. The real reckoning was coming, carried on the shoulders of men and women who refused to let their doc be forgotten. And soon they would arrive, not in words, but in uniforms. Not as whispers, but as a presence no one could ignore. Monday mornings at the Riverside Diner were usually quiet. The scent of fresh coffee floated in the air. The clatter of silverware blended with the sizzle from the griddle, and only a handful of early risers filled the booths. Truckers passing through, old men nursing black coffee, and a few locals with newspapers usually made up the crowd. It was the kind of slow start Daniel Morgan preferred. Less noise, less attention, fewer eyes lingering on the scars that marked his skin. But this Monday was different. The bell above the door jingled at precisely 0700, and a man in pressed Marine Corps blues stepped inside. His metals caught the pale morning light, glinting like sparks. Without a word, he chose a booth near the center of the diner. When the waitress approached, he placed a small card on the table. The card was stark white, the handwriting neat. "Thank you, Doc." Daniel noticed it immediately. His chest tightened. He froze with a tray in his hands, staring longer than he should have. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to find the quiet safety of the kitchen, but his feet stayed rooted to the floor. The bell rang again. Another uniform entered. Army this time, then another, and another. Navy blues, fatigues, service dress. Within minutes, the diner, which normally held only a scattering of locals, was filled with rows of uniforms. They came in groups, some quiet, some laughing softly, all with a strange sense of purpose. Every single one carried the same kind of card. They slid them onto tables, propped them against salt shakers, tucked them beneath coffee mugs. Always the same words. "Thank you, Doc." The ordinary rhythm of the diner cracked. Regulars stopped mid-sip, forks hovered in midair. Eyes widened as the sea of uniforms spread out, filling every corner, every booth, every counter stool. By the time the last group entered, there were no seats left. Some stood along the walls, hats tucked under their arms, waiting patiently as if the diner had become holy ground. Daniel's breath came shallow, uneven. His hands gripped the tray so hard his knuckles whitened. He had faced ambushes, mortars, chaos. He had dragged bleeding men across burning sand. Yet this quiet flood of gratitude, threatened to undo him in ways bullets never could. He felt exposed, naked in a way that had nothing to do with scars. Mike, the manager, stood near the counter, his jaw slack, eyes darting from one uniform to the next. He had no idea how to run a diner filled with veterans in full dress. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen sounded strange against the solemn weight that had settled in the room. Daniel forced himself forward, step by step, carrying the tray to a booth where 3 Marines sat stiff-backed, eyes fixed on him with something between reverence and relief. He poured water into their glasses, his hand trembling just slightly. One of the Marines, a gunnery sergeant with gray at his temples, pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. The diner fell silent, forks lowered, conversations hushed. All eyes turned toward them. The sergeant raised his hand in a salute, sharp and deliberate. His voice carried across the room, low but strong. "Thank you for not leaving anyone behind that night." The words cut through Daniel like a blade and a balm at once. His throat constricted. Memories slammed into him, blood pooling in sand, the weight of bodies over his shoulders, the relentless pounding of his own heart as he ran. He wanted to shake his head, to say he hadn't done enough, but the salute held him in place. Slowly, stiffly, Daniel set the tray down and raised his own hand in return. The motion was rusty, awkward, but it was enough. One by one others rose, soldiers, sailors, Marines, salutes, handshakes, nods. Some stepped forward to clasp his hand, gripping tightly, eyes shining with unshed tears. Others simply stood, their silence louder than any words. A Navy officer approached, her uniform immaculate, her steps steady despite the tremor in her lips. She held something small in her hand, wrapped in a velvet pouch. She stopped in front of Daniel and pressed it into his palm. "This belonged to my father," she said softly. "He was hit in Fallujah. You were there. He told us before he passed that the medal he wore didn't belong to him. It belonged to the man who saved him. He wanted you to have it." Daniel opened the pouch and stared down at a purple heart, the medal catching the light. His chest heaved, his vision blurred. He shook his head, trying to give it back, but she pressed his fingers closed around it. "He said you were the real hero of Fallujah." Daniel's legs felt weak beneath him. The diner around him blurred into a haze of faces, uniforms, cards, and gratitude he wasn't sure he deserved. He wanted to disappear, to retreat into silence, but the tide of recognition held him fast. Customers who weren't part of the gathering watched it with wide eyes. Some wept quietly at their booths, dabbing at tears with napkins. Others simply sat in reverent silence, bearing witness to something far larger than a diner breakfast. The air vibrated with unspoken truth. A man they had overlooked, dismissed, even mocked, had once stood between life and death for countless others. Mike wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to steady himself. He had worked in restaurants for years, seen every kind of customer, every kind of scene, but he had never seen anything like this. A moment where the ordinary world bent under the weight of extraordinary truth. He felt ashamed of every time he had pushed Daniel into the shadows. Ashamed and yet proud because now the shadows had no hold. Daniel stood frozen, the purple heart in his hand, the cards scattered across tables, the salutes still echoing in his ears. He didn't know how to respond. Words felt too small, too fragile. All he could do was nod, swallow hard, and keep moving. He filled glasses, poured coffee, cleared plates, tasks that felt absurdly small in the presence of such reverence. Yet somehow, those small acts steadied him. As he moved from table to table, veterans reached for his hand, clapped his shoulder, called him Doc, with voices thick with gratitude. Each touch, each word pulled him further from the silence he had lived in, further into a truth he couldn't escape. He had not been forgotten. The morning stretched long, every second etched deep into memory. When the uniforms finally began to leave, one by one, they didn't just vanish. They left their cards on the tables, their notes tucked under mugs, their tips folded neatly into napkins. By the time the last Marine walked out, the diner looked less like a restaurant and more like a shrine. White cards with black letters, "Thank you, Doc," covered every surface. Daniel stood in the center of it, unable to move. His hand still clutched the purple heart. His heart pounded, his breath uneven. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, unbearably seen, and the weight of it pressed down on him with both pain and grace. Outside, the day went on as usual. Cars passed, the sun rose higher. But inside the Riverside Diner, nothing was the same. The silence that had defined Daniel's life was gone, replaced by a chorus of gratitude that would echo long after the uniforms left. And though Daniel longed to retreat, to fold himself back into the shadows, he knew the tide had turned. The world had remembered him, and there was no going back. The diner had barely settled from the wave of uniforms when another tide arrived. This time it wasn't silent cards or solemn handshakes, it was cameras. Local news crews pulled into the parking lot, their vans lined with satellite dishes and logos plastered across the sides. Reporters hurried through the door with microphones in hand, cameramen trailing close behind, lenses already rolling. Mike, the manager, stiffened behind the counter. He hadn't called them, but someone had. Perhaps one of the veterans who'd been there, or maybe a customer who couldn't keep the moment to themselves. Either way, the diner that had once been overlooked by everyone was suddenly the center of attention. Daniel was at the sink in the back when he heard the commotion. Voices rose in overlapping pitches, the scrape of chairs, the rustle of equipment. His shoulders tightened. He didn't need to look to know what was happening. He had felt this before, when attention pressed in, unwanted, inescapable. He stayed where he was, drying his hands on a towel, breathing through the panic clawing at his chest. Mike entered the kitchen, his face pale, eyes darting. "They're here," he said. "The press. They're asking for you." Daniel's head shook instantly. "No. They want to tell your story." "I don't have a story." Mike hesitated, then lowered his voice. "You do, Daniel, and it's not yours alone anymore. It belongs to all the people who wrote those letters, to the men and women who filled this place yesterday. They showed up because of you. The least we can do is not hide you anymore." The words cut sharper than Mike realized. For months, he had kept Daniel in the shadows, moving him to the back, pretending it was for business when it was really for comfort, his own and the customers. Now he was saying the opposite. Daniel didn't know whether to laugh or break. Still, when Mike returned to the front, Daniel remained behind. He could hear the manager's voice, steadier than before. "I need to say something first," Mike told the reporters. The hum of chatter dimmed, the clatter of dishes silenced. "I made mistakes. When Daniel Morgan came to work here, I thought it best to keep him out of sight. I thought people wouldn't want to look at him. I was wrong. He's not someone to hide. He's an honor to have here, and I'll never make that mistake again." The words rippled through the room. Customers nodded, some murmuring agreement. The cameras caught every syllable, every crease of guilt across Mike's face. Then the door opened again, and Carl Wilson entered with both his sons. His eldest, Lieutenant James Wilson, carried himself with the unmistakable poise of someone who had worn the uniform and seen too much. Beside him, Alex looked smaller than usual, his eyes lowered, his steps hesitant. Carl guided them both forward, his jaw set, his expression grim. Daniel emerged from the kitchen then, drawn not by the cameras, but by the presence he felt the moment James stepped inside. Their eyes locked across the diner, and in that instant, recognition flared. "Third vehicle," James said, his voice rough, carrying across the room. "Convoy ambush. You pulled me out with a fractured femur." Daniel's lips parted, his chest tight. The memory was immediate, brutal, smoke filling the air, the sharp crack of gunfire, the weight of James slung over his shoulder as he stumbled through chaos. He hadn't known if they'd make it. Yet here James stood, alive, his eyes full of gratitude that years could not dim. "You were half dead yourself," James continued, stepping closer. "But you didn't stop. I remember every second." The diner was silent, every face turned toward them, every camera catching the exchange. James turned, placing a hand on his younger brother's shoulder. "Alex," he said firmly, "you need to speak." Alex swallowed hard, his cheeks flushed crimson. He stepped forward, his eyes flicking nervously between Daniel and the cameras. His voice cracked at first, but he forced the words out. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what you'd done. I just saw someone different. And I was cruel. I mocked you, and I hurt you, and I can't take that back. But I'm sorry. I was wrong." His words trembled in the air, fragile but genuine. The weight of shame hung heavy on his shoulders, and for the first time in his young life, Alex felt the full consequence of his actions. Daniel studied him quietly. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with something beyond fear, remorse, raw and unguarded. Slowly, Daniel stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was steady, quiet, but carried the weight of truth. "I forgive you," he said. Alex blinked, startled, his breath catching. "No one chooses how they get wounded," Daniel continued, his gaze sweeping the room, lingering on Alex but speaking to everyone. "But we all choose how we treat each other afterward. That's what matters. The words struck like a bell, resonant and clear. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras leaned closer, but the silence in the diner was deeper than any microphone could capture. Carl exhaled heavily, his hand tightening on Alex's shoulder. Pride and sorrow warred across his face. He had seen his son's cruelty, and now he saw his son's first steps toward understanding. It was more than he had dared hope for. James extended his hand. Daniel grasped it firmly, the grip strong, the bond immediate. Two men who had shared the worst of war met again in peace, their handshake captured by flashing cameras, frozen forever as an image of survival, of connection, of grace. Customers rose to their feet, some applauding softly, others simply standing in reverence. The diner that once rang with cruel laughter now echoed with something entirely different: respect, forgiveness, a sense of redemption that spread like warmth through every corner. The reporters, sensing the gravity of the moment, asked questions, but Daniel shook his head. "I'm not here for interviews," he said. "I'm here to work, to serve food, not stories." Yet even as he said it, he knew the story had already left his hands. It belonged to the world now. Still, he turned back to the counter, picked up a coffee pot, and moved from table to table, pouring refills with the same quiet dignity as before. Customers thanked him softly, calling him Doc, their eyes shining. For the first time, the word didn't feel like a chain dragging him back to the battlefield. It felt like a bridge, connecting him to people who finally understood. As the crowd thinned and the cameras packed up, the Wilson family lingered. James gripped Daniel's shoulder one last time, his voice low. "You saved me once. Let me stand with you now." Daniel gave a small nod, no words left. He didn't need them. Outside, the vans pulled away, carrying with them images that would soon circle the state, then the nation. The story of the scarred man mocked in a diner, the father who stood up, the soldiers who returned, the boy who apologized, and the forgiveness that silenced a room. It would spread far beyond the cracked pavement of that small-town street. Inside, Daniel returned to his work, his scars unchanged, his silence still present. But something had shifted. The world had seen, and he had spoken, not about battles or medals, but about forgiveness. And in that, perhaps, he had found something greater than recognition, something closer to peace. The footage spread faster than anyone in town could comprehend. Within hours of the news crews leaving the Riverside Diner, clips of Daniel Morgan shaking hands with Lieutenant James Wilson appeared on local broadcasts, then regional channels, and finally national outlets. Online, the video gained traction even faster. A scarred man in a diner uniform, speaking of forgiveness with a voice that trembled but did not falter, captured the attention of millions. The internet had already tasted the uglier side of the story, the mocking photos, the cruel captions, but now it was being served something very different. Where derision once thrived, admiration now bloomed. Comment sections filled with messages of gratitude, awe, and reflection. Veterans wrote long paragraphs about what Doc Morgan had done for them. Parents told their children to watch the video as a lesson. Teenagers, some not much older than Alex, admitted they felt ashamed of how quickly they judged people by appearances. The cruel images of Daniel's face were replaced almost overnight. New photographs circulated instead. Daniel shaking James's hand, Daniel receiving the Purple Heart from the Navy officer's daughter, Daniel pouring coffee with quiet dignity, while a line of veterans looked on in reverence. These images carried a different weight. They told a story not of scars, but of survival, not of mockery, but of grace. At the diner, business changed in ways no one had anticipated. Customers lined up outside in the mornings, not just for the pancakes or burgers, but for the chance to sit in the place where forgiveness had been spoken aloud. Families drove from neighboring towns, some carrying handwritten notes, others bringing photographs of loved ones who had served. They wanted to leave something behind for Daniel, a message, a token, a memory. Mike, the manager, had to adjust quickly. What once felt like a sleepy roadside stop was now buzzing with attention. He ordered more supplies, hired extra help, and rearranged shifts. But more than logistics, he faced the humbling reality that his diner had become a symbol of something greater than itself. He watched Daniel work the floor, moving with the same quiet discipline as always, but now with a steady stream of people approaching him. Some spoke softly, others simply placed a hand on his arm, but all carried the same message. You matter. We remember. For Daniel, it was overwhelming. He had lived for years in silence, certain the world wanted to forget men like him, or at least to keep them hidden. Now the opposite was true. People saw him everywhere he went. A trip to the grocery store ended with strangers shaking his hand. A walk down the street brought waves and nods. He could no longer disappear into anonymity. One evening, as the dinner rush slowed, a small crowd lingered near the counter. They weren't waiting for food, they were waiting for him. A woman stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held out a framed photograph. "This is my brother," she said. "He never made it home. But his last letter mentioned you. He said, if you see Doc Morgan again, tell him I held on because of him. I never thought I'd get the chance to tell you myself." Daniel looked at the photograph, a young Marine smiling in uniform, and felt a sharp ache in his chest. He remembered the night. He remembered the blood. He remembered the way he had fought to keep that young man alive, even as the odds collapsed around them. He handed the photograph back carefully, his voice low. "He was brave, braver than I'll ever be." The woman shook her head, tears streaming. "No, he said you were the reason he had a chance. That matters to us." Moments like that multiplied. Each one was both a burden and a gift. Daniel absorbed them quietly, never seeking the spotlight, but unable to stop the tide that carried his story further into the world. The diner itself embraced the new identity. Mike hung a framed sign near the entrance. "Proud to have American heroes on our staff. Medal of Honor nominee Daniel Morgan serves here." Beneath it, he placed a collage of the thank you cards, receipts, and letters that had poured in over the past weeks. Customers stopped to read them, some wiping tears from their cheeks before sitting down to order. Despite the growing attention, Daniel resisted the idea of being a symbol. When reporters returned, hoping for a longer interview, he declined. When organizations called, inviting him to speak at events, he refused politely. "I'm not a story," he told Mike one evening. "I'm just a man who did his job." But not everyone agreed. Yes. One afternoon, Carl Wilson returned with his sons. This time, Alex carried stacks of printed flyers, his eyes clearer, his steps purposeful. He and his friends had chosen to turn their mistake into something constructive. They handed out flyers for a fundraiser supporting wounded warriors, explaining to customers that proceeds would go toward medical care and support for veterans. Some people gave cash on the spot. Others signed up to volunteer. Alex approached Daniel hesitantly, holding out a flyer. "We wanted to do something right," he said. "For you, for all of them. I can't erase what I did, but I can try to honor you now." Daniel accepted the flyer, studying it for a long moment. His face was unreadable, but his eyes softened just slightly. "It's a start," he said quietly. The small exchange mattered more than Alex could have imagined. For weeks he had carried the shame of his cruelty. Now he felt the first spark of redemption, not because Daniel erased his guilt, but because Daniel gave him a path forward. The fundraiser grew quickly, drawing support from across the state. Soon, the teens who once mocked Daniel were standing on street corners, handing out pamphlets, speaking to strangers about respect, loyalty, and sacrifice. Their laughter had once wounded. Now their voices carried a different tone, earnest, humble, determined. Through it all, Daniel kept working. He cleared tables, filled coffee cups, and carried plates. Customers whispered "Doc" with reverence as he passed, but he never let the title change him. He remained grounded, rooted in the same quiet dignity that had carried him through war and through silence alike. One evening, as the diner closed, Carl lingered behind. He approached Daniel at the counter, his voice low. "You could go anywhere now. Washington, New York, even the Pentagon. They'd welcome you, honor you. Why stay here?" Daniel paused, wiping down the counter with deliberate strokes. Finally, he looked up, his eyes steady. "Because here, I'm just Daniel. Not a headline, not a sad story, not a poster, just a man doing a job." Carl studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That may be the bravest choice of all. Outside, the line of customers waiting for the diner to open the next day had already begun to form. Some carried notes, others small gifts, all eager for the chance to share space with the man whose scars told stories of sacrifice and survival. From viral shame to viral grace, the world had turned. The diner that once mocked him now honored him. The teens who once ridiculed him now stood as his advocates. The town that once looked away now looked toward him. And in the center of it all stood Daniel Morgan, scarred, silent, but no longer invisible. Weeks passed, but the waves of attention never truly receded. The Riverside Diner remained crowded, lines stretching out the door on weekends, veterans and civilians alike gathering not only for food, but for the chance to sit in the presence of a man they now called a living reminder of sacrifice. Daniel Morgan endured it with quiet resilience. He worked each shift the same way he always had, clearing tables, pouring coffee, and moving through the crowd with his silent dignity. But inside, the constant stares wore on him. No matter how respectful, no matter how kind, being seen all the time felt like standing on a battlefield with no cover. He could not shake the ache of being on display. One gray morning, as the wind rattled the diner's old windows, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was heavier than most, its paper thick, the seal embossed with the crest of the Department of Defense. Mike, curious, turned it over in his hands before sliding it across the counter toward Daniel. "This one's for you," Mike said quietly. Daniel frowned at the official seal, reluctant even to touch it. He had received envelopes like this before, long ago, when his world was sand and fire. With slow hands, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. It was a formal invitation from the Pentagon. Words filled the page in stiff, bureaucratic language, but their meaning was clear. He was being invited to a ceremony recognizing battlefield medics, a gathering where his name would be spoken aloud among candidates for the Medal of Honor. Mike let out a low whistle. That's something else, Daniel. They want to honor you. The whole country will be watching." Daniel folded the letter once, then again, before sliding it back into the envelope. His face was unreadable, his voice flat. "I won't go." Mike blinked. "You won't what? Daniel, do you know what this means? The Medal of Honor isn't just some certificate, it's—" "I know what it is," Daniel interrupted, his tone sharper than usual. He placed the envelope on the counter and pushed it away. "And I don't need it." The silence that followed was heavy. Mike stared at him, struggling to understand. "Then what do you need?" Daniel wiped his hands on his apron, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I need normal days. I need to work my shift, go home, sleep without hearing their voices. I don't need a stage, nor a ceremony. I don't need the world to clap for scars they don't understand. I just need to be Daniel." Mike didn't argue further. He simply nodded, though a part of him still ached with the thought that the world might never see Daniel receive the recognition he deserved. Word of the invitation spread anyway. Some veterans urged him to go, insisting it was his duty. Others respected his choice, understanding too well the burden of being placed on a pedestal when all you wanted was to stand on even ground. Customers began asking him about it, sliding questions into their conversations. But Daniel always brushed them aside with the same quiet answer: "I won't be going." Despite his refusal, the community adjusted around him. People who came to the diner began to respect his silence, understanding that their gratitude didn't need a stage or a medal to be real. They asked less of him, choosing instead to sit quietly, to eat their meals with reverence, to leave small notes of thanks without expectation of a reply. One afternoon, a man in a faded army jacket left a card on the counter. It contained only a single sentence, written in careful block letters: "Your scars are medals we cannot wear for you." Daniel carried that card in his pocket for days, pulling it out in the quiet moments when the weight of everything threatened to break him. For all the attention, Daniel clung to routine. He still walked to work each morning, boots scuffing against the same cracked sidewalks. He still sat in his small apartment at night, eating simple meals, reading old books, avoiding the television. Fame might have found him, but he refused to live in its spotlight. Alex Wilson and his friends continued their work on the fundraiser. Flyers hung in grocery stores, schools, and churches. Their campaign gathered momentum, raising thousands of dollars for wounded veterans. When they stopped by the diner to update Daniel, he listened quietly, offering only a nod of acknowledgement. But inside, something softened. Their voices, once mocking, now carried the sound of earnestness. Perhaps they had learned something lasting. Lieutenant James Wilson visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with other veterans. He and Daniel spoke little about the past, but when they did, it was never about medals or ceremonies. It was about the men they had both known, the moments that lingered in memory like shadows. James often said, "I wouldn't be here without you." But Daniel always deflected, "You would have done the same for me." Carl Wilson remained a steady presence as well. He stopped by the diner every few days, not to draw attention, but simply to sit at the counter and share a coffee. His respect for Daniel ran deeper than words, and though he never pushed, he always hoped Daniel might one day reconsider the Pentagon's invitation. But Daniel's mind was made up. When another letter arrived, this time with details of the event, a schedule, and a request for confirmation, he folded it neatly, placed it in the bottom drawer of his nightstand, and shut it away. He would not go. The town accepted his choice. They began to see him not as a man avoiding recognition, but as someone teaching them a lesson by living it. Honor, they realized, wasn't defined by ceremonies or medals pinned to uniforms. Honor lived in scars carried without bitterness, in forgiveness offered when it wasn't deserved, in the quiet strength of a man who simply chose to keep showing up. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and gold, Daniel stood outside the diner, leaning against the brick wall. The streets were quiet, the rush of the day behind him. A boy no older than 10 walked up, holding a crumpled piece of notebook paper. "My dad said you're the reason he came home," the boy said shyly. "I wanted to say thank you." He handed over the paper, a drawing of a soldier with a medic by his side. Beneath it, in clumsy handwriting, were the words, "Heroes look like you." Daniel stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. He crouched, looking the boy in the eyes. "Your dad's the hero," he said softly. The boy shook his head. "He says you are." Daniel folded the drawing carefully and tucked it into his pocket. He said nothing more, but when he walked home that night, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. The invitation remained in his drawer, untouched. The world could keep its ceremonies, its applause, its medals. Daniel Morgan had chosen a different path. He had chosen to be just a man, scarred, quiet, ordinary. And perhaps, in that ordinariness, he carried a lesson greater than any award could bestow. The world outside the diner might have seen Daniel Morgan as a hero, but inside those four walls, he remained the same quiet man, clearing tables, pouring coffee, moving through each shift with a steady pace that never faltered. Fame, headlines, even whispers of medals had not changed him. Yet without realizing it, he had already begun to change the people around him. It started with something small. On a Tuesday afternoon, while the lunch rush eased, Daniel noticed a group of teenagers gathered in the back corner of the diner. They weren't laughing or snapping photos like the ones who once mocked him. These kids leaned over notebooks and small medical kits, their hands fumbling with rolls of gauze and plastic tourniquets. An off-duty paramedic sat with them, demonstrating how to wrap a wound, how to stop bleeding in an emergency. Daniel paused, his tray in hand, watching from a distance. The sight stirred something deep within him, a memory not of combat but of purpose. He had been trained once to save lives in chaos. He had carried that training into hell and back. Now, watching these kids tie sloppy knots and laugh at their mistakes, he felt the faint stirrings of something long buried. Mike noticed too. The manager approached with a grin. They asked if they could use the back booth for a few weeks. Some community thing, first aid basics. I said yes. He glanced at Daniel, lowering his voice. "Honestly, I thought of you. They probably don't even realize who's watching over them." Daniel didn't reply, but that night he carried the image of the kids fumbling with bandages into his sleep. By the following week, the group had doubled. Parents began dropping their children off at the diner, trusting the space not just for food, but for learning. Mike even set aside an hour before closing, dimming the lights in the back so the paramedic could demonstrate under field conditions. Daniel watched each session quietly, never interfering, though the urge to step in grew stronger with every mistake he saw. One evening, a boy pressed too hard with the tourniquet, cutting off circulation entirely. The paramedic corrected him gently, but Daniel found himself speaking before he realized it. "Looser, enough to stop bleeding, not enough to kill the limb." The boy looked up, startled. The paramedic raised his brows, then nodded in agreement. "He's right." All eyes turned to Daniel. He shifted uncomfortably, wishing he had stayed silent. But the moment had already passed. The kids leaned forward, curious. "Can you show us?" one asked. Daniel hesitated, his pulse quickening. For years, he had avoided stepping into any role that resembled what he once was. But the faces staring at him weren't hardened Marines or desperate comrades. They were children, eager, unscarred, unknowing of the cost of mistakes. With a deep breath, he set down his tray and walked over. He picked up the tourniquet, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. "You see this?" he said, his voice low but clear. "If you pull too hard, you'll do more damage than the wound. If you don't pull hard enough, the bleeding won't stop. Balance is the difference between life and death." He tightened the straw with practiced ease, demonstrating the exact pressure. Like this. The room was silent, every eye locked on him. The boy nodded, trying again, mimicking Daniel's movements. This time it was right. From that night on, Daniel became part of the lessons. At first, he offered only small corrections, brief demonstrations. But soon the paramedic began deferring to him. "You've seen more than I have," the man admitted one evening. "These kids can learn from you in ways I can't teach." Daniel resisted at first, reluctant to step into a role that reminded him of everything he had lost. But slowly the weight shifted. He realized that teaching these children wasn't about reliving the battlefield. It was about preventing the next tragedy, about giving them the skills to save each other when the world turned cruel, as it always did sooner or later. Word spread and the weekly sessions grew. Teenagers who once wasted time on their phones now practice bandaging, CPR, and basic trauma care. Parents watched from booths, grateful. Mike even donated part of the diner's storage room, clearing space for supplies and folding chairs. He hung a simple sign above the doorway. "Community First Aid Nights," inspired by Doc Morgan. Daniel wanted to protest, but he didn't. The sign was not for him, it was for them. One night, Alex Wilson showed up with his friends, the same group who had once laughed at Daniel's scars. They sat in the front row, paying rapt attention. Alex practiced chest compressions with such intensity that sweat beaded on his forehead. During a break, he approached Daniel quietly. "You saved my brother once," Alex said. "Maybe I can save someone too." Daniel studied him, seeing not the boy who had mocked him, but a young man carrying the weight of change. He gave a short nod. "That's the right way to think." The sessions continued, week after week, until the diner became more than a place to eat. It became a place where knowledge passed from scars to fresh hands, where the lessons of survival turned into tools for the future. Daniel never sought recognition, but in those quiet hours, he found something he hadn't realized he was missing. Purpose. Not the heavy, crushing purpose of war, but the lighter, sustaining kind. The purpose of knowing the next generation might be stronger, better prepared, more compassionate because of what he had shared. As months passed, the community adapted to Daniel's presence not as a spectacle, but as part of their rhythm. Customers still nodded and thanked him, but the frenzy of attention faded into something steadier, quieter, more enduring. He was not forgotten, but he was no longer trapped in the glare of sudden fame. One evening, after a particularly crowded training session, Daniel lingered in the diner after everyone had gone. The chairs were stacked, the lights dimmed, the silence deep. On the table before him lay a scattering of drawings and thank you notes from the kids. One read, "Because of you, I want to be a nurse." Another, "I want to help people like you did." He gathered the notes, his rough hands careful on the fragile paper. For the first time in years, his chest felt light. He had not sought out this role, but perhaps it had found him anyway. He looked at the scars reflected faintly in the diner's darkened window. They no longer felt like chains. They felt like reminders. Marks of battles survived, yes, but also marks of lessons earned. Lessons he could pass on. Daniel Morgan, once mocked as a monster, once burdened with silence, had become something else entirely. Not a symbol on a stage, not a headline in the news, but a teacher, a guide, a man who turned hurt into help, who transformed scars into tools for others. And in that quiet diner, with the scent of coffee still lingering and the sound of distant laughter fading into the night, he finally understood. True honor did not come from medals or ceremonies. It came from the hands he guided, the lives he might never see, but could still save through knowledge passed on. The battlefield was behind him, but the work of saving lives had never truly ended. It had simply changed shape.